We had a top of the table clash today between Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces and Shakhriyar Mamedyarov with the black pieces, and it did not disappoint. So as expected, Magnus Carlsen played the Catalan opening here. He's so deeply prepared in these lines following the World Championship, and this thing got really chaotic really fast. So let's see what happened. And if you love a daily chess video, then do hit that subscribe button. So after these standard opening moves here, pawn to g3, black takes on c4, bishop to g2, and now Shak plays bishop to b4 check. An interesting move. So Magnus blocks here, and pawn to a5. Now this has been seen a number of times before. The idea here is that if you do take this with white, and after the pawn recaptures, it's not such a good transition of pawn structure because it hampers some of your natural development on the queen side, and black just gets some free and easy play with castles, knight c6. You might get a quick e5 in, so not what you want as white. Instead, Magnus castles here. We had castles from black, and now pawn to e3 from Magnus. A really interesting kind of sideline here. You know, more commonly you're going to see things like queen c2, let's say. But Magnus is playing these pet moves. He's very deeply prepared, putting black on the back foot. So Shak had to think about how to play here. Now he wants to play b5, but then a4 would come, and it's a bit uncomfortable to try and defend all this. Bishop b7 is a possible line, but you certainly can't go pawn to c6, because after captures here, you can't take back, or after bishop takes on b4, there's a pin here which is a problem. And if you took here first, well then the f knight can take back the bishop, and once again you can't capture the pawn because of the pin here. So coming back here, that's why Shak played this move here of rook to a6. Looks weird, but he's preparing b5 and taking the rook off this long diagonal. So now we had queen to c2 preparing to pick up the pawn, pawn to b5 defends, pawn to a4 undermines, pawn c6, and now knight to c3 from Magnus. Once again there's a threat to take twice here. Now one way to resolve this threat is by taking the knight on c3. The pawn would recapture in this instance so as not to run into b4, but this isn't a good pawn structure transition for black because white's going to probably bring a rook across to the b file. These pawns are well under control and you can soon set up the big centre with e4, just not a nice position for black. Lots of pressure for white. So Shak recognises this and goes rook to b6 here, and now Magnus sets up the big centre with pawn to e4. Very thematic stuff, threatening e5 in a lot of lines, clearing that knight out of the way, opening the queen to h7, and supported by knight g5, this can get quickly very dangerous for black. So Shak has to respond to that, and one of the main ways to do this is just by playing pawn to h6 here. Now if e5 comes, the knight sits fine on d5. If captures here, then we can take back with the pawn. Black's doing well. But coming back here, Shak didn't play pawn to h6 here. Instead he played bishop e7, a really provocative move because it runs straight into e5, which Magnus did play. The knight came to d5, and now you could take here immediately, but instead Magnus takes here. This did give Shak an option of going knight to b4. The queen would probably come to say e4 here, and the game goes on, different game. But instead of coming into b4, Shak took here, allowing Magnus to take this knight. Now you can't take back with the queen, or knight g5 is a killer, once again hitting the queen and threatening mate, game over. So that's why Shak took back with the pawn here, but this allowed Magnus to take on a5 with the bishop. Black is losing in exchange. So what's going on? Has a super GM started playing like a patzer? Well, no. Shak's idea here is that after knight to c6, bishop takes on b6, queen recaptures, he can use these pawns which are now connected and coming menacingly down the board to create a lot of pressure against white on the queen side. He also has the bishop pair. he also has pressure against d4 with 2 pieces, as we can see here. And there may be an element of psychology here that he was trying to take Magnus out of his comfort zone and out of prepared lines, because you're playing against all of this deep prep, of course. But Magnus remains unfazed here and plays the excellent rook to a8, giving black some things to think about in terms of development, and leaving this pawn on prise, but he's not bothered if it gets taken, because if black went in for this, which didn't happen, then the knight can recapture, and after queen takes, rook d1, even though the queen picks up a second pawn, you take here on d5. Now you are giving black a check here, and after the bishop blocks, bishop h3 is possible. So what's going on here? Well, white has the saving grace of queen to e2. You can play it immediately, or you can swap the rooks like this, king captures, and then queen e2. And the whole point is that you're forcing the queens off here, the bishop recaptures, and you're picking up one of these pawns by force. So that's why Shak didn't go in for this whole line. Excellent calculation by both players. Coming back to the actual game position, instead of taking on d4, Shak instead played pawn to h6 here. So getting out of any nasties with knight g5 later, we had rook f to a1 from Magnus, bishop to e6, so Shak is forced to develop that one, give Magnus the exchange if he wants it, but Magnus doesn't go in for this. Instead he plays queen d1. Now he does defend the pawn, given that the bishop has come to e6 and defended d5 now. We had pawn to b4 from Shak, so he gets on with that plan of pushing the pawns, and he'd love to go pawn to b3 here to clamp down on the black position, open the b4 square for the knight, and entomb this light squared bishop behind its own lines. But a really positionally astute move now from Magnus, pawn to b3. Excellent, because although you allow pawn to c3, black has a passed pawn, you open up all of these light squares now for the bishop, which it didn't have before, and you also give the knight options now to sit on c2 or d3. Very powerful stuff. So now Magnus plays another brilliant move, rook 8 to a6. He nudges the queen away from the attack on the d4 pawn. After it moves away, now he drops the knight back because there's no more pressure here. So we had pawn to f6 now from Shak. It's a really tough position and it's hard to know what to play here. He goes for activity because he doesn't want to get just squashed positionally by sitting there. But f6 is a blunder because now it allows Magnus to play the incredibly strong knight to d3. And this knight is headed for the f4 square. That's the big threat here, hitting all of these light squared weaknesses. And although you leave this pawn, again Shak didn't take it, this is no good for black because the rook can now chop on e6. After the knight recaptures, d5 is collapsing and you're actually winning this piece by force. If you try to defend it with the queen, then knight to f4 is the really powerful follow-up. So coming back here, that's why Shak didn't take on d4. Instead he took the pawn on e5 and Magnus recaptured with the knight now. And the whole idea here is that after black captures the knight, you don't recapture here. This is still winning, but way less powerful than the game continuation. Instead, you take on e6, and there are so many problems for black now. And just to give one line here to give you a sense of that, if you play knight to c6, looks logical, holds the bishop, you've still got the passed pawn, well then bishop to d5 comes. It's a complete killer, because not only do you have all of these discovered checks, you're also hitting this knight twice now, and you just can't deal with it all as black. So that's why the knight didn't move away. Instead, Shak tried pawn to c2, but after queen to e1, he actually resigned the game. It's completely over. Why did he resign? Well, if you try something like, say, knight to d3, attacking the queen, threatening to queen here, once again, bishop d5 just kills it. You could also take on e7 there, but the tactics just aren't working for black. Say you take on e1, for example, well then you can take on e7 with check. And coming back here, if instead of taking the queen like this, you try to actually queen the pawn, well again there's various ways to win, but here's a nice one, rook to c6, discovered check. Now the king comes to h8, You can take on c1 with the queen now. And once again, if you take the queen here, we're simply taking here with great advantage. And if you don't take the queen and try to save your own, say with queen to d7, well, now we have a beautiful checkmating finish. Rook takes on h6. The pawn has to recapture and the queen comes crashing in. That's mate. If you enjoyed this game, then do hit here to subscribe to the channel, and to see more amazing Tata steel games, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.